Welcome to Open Conversations on topic psychoanalysis of rape. Namaste. The recent tragic rape event at Kolkata has shook everyone to his core. It is a series of tragedy, ceaseless despite capital punishment prescribed in law for rape. Obviously, the legal measures, possessions, and media outreach has not worked. It is so calls for a deeper analytical approach to the problem, and conversation today on it is with our subject expert, Dr. Himanshu Vaidya. Namaste, sir.
Namaste.
Sir, why has law, possessions, and media outreach failed so miserably in controlling the tragedy of rape?
Obviously, the problem diagnosis and the solution has not been comprehensive and accurate. If this had been comprehensive and accurate, the problem would have got solved by now. And therefore, we have to go into what has stopped the right identification and right resolution of the problem. And this calls for a deeper analysis of this whole context and the act of rape. One reason, and there are many reasons, one reason why all the action by activists, NGOs has not actually paid out is because there is no credibility. It's more of tokenism. It's more notional. When the event happens, you get into an activist mode for a month and then you are nowhere to be seen. The victim also does not get help from you. The perpetrator, rightly or wrongly caught, he also does not get any hearing from you. There is no action from the government except for the customary catching hold of somebody or filing an FIR and so. So this credibility and tokenism, that has resulted in a very short-term influence on stakeholders. So if you look at rape, and if you look at all the stakeholders, including the society at large, the influence on all the stakeholders is minimal, and they look upon it more as a cosmetic exercise, as an exercise in advancing one's self-interest in terms of making oneself or one's NGO more visible, get more of the media space, or in more difficult and immoral situations to make more money out of blackmailing somebody. So this has led to the minimalization of the effect that it has on this whole system. The second part is this always becomes more like a mob cry for capital punishment. And they actually want it to be seen as a law and order problem. So the entire activism is around law and order as the cause for this tragedy. And if we were to set right law and order, this tragedy can be completely eliminated. The second problem with this activism, that they don't understand the multidimensional nature of the problem. And because many dimensions of the problem remain unaddressed, even unrecognized, the problem is not solved, because it's not a law and order problem. What has happened is that because of this mob, this bloodthirsty mob kind of activism, they have asked for stricter laws, even capital punishment. What it does actually is something detrimental to the cause that they are advocating. Once the penalty is high, the courts become stricter in terms of evidence. It becomes more and more difficult to get a conviction. If the punishment is 2 years, it is easy to get a conviction. If the punishment is 20 years, the court will think 5 times before giving conviction. So the rate of conviction automatically will fall the moment you make the punishment so strict that the court will think 5 times before convicting anybody. The second side effect of this capital punishment business is that now the perpetrator knows that if the victim is kept alive, her testimony will hang him from the noose. So what he does is, after committing the rape, he commits the murder and disposes of the body. So the capital punishment has also created a situation where it has become capital punishment also for the victim. The perpetrator may or may not get from the court, but the victim definitely gets it from the perpetrator. Because for him, that is the license, a possibility of getting free from the legal system. So for him, destruction of evidence means he has to destroy the victim and dispose of the body so that the forensic test cannot be done on the body. So this is a side effect of very strict punishment, especially the capital punishment part of it. And then we have this whole difficulty of the innocent getting trapped by the misuse of law. Any law can be misused and is misused to the tune of 1 to 3%. This law, unfortunately, is misused to the tune of 5 to 10%, and that's a very large misuse. The law on sexual harassment, the law on dowry, the law on rape, and the law on atrocity. These are the laws where courts themselves have observed very high percentage of misuse of law, abuse of law. So that is another problem with this type of militant activism, which focuses only on this capital punishment thing, without going into the whole paraphernalia, the multidimensional nature of the problem. So this is one reason why, despite so many events, so many cycles of protests, so many laws getting stricter every time, we have not solved the problem. And obviously, because the problem identification is not correct.
So what is the real problem then underlying this phenomenon?
First, we have to understand that this is not as exceptional a crime as we believe it to be. That does not take away the seriousness of the crime. We are not apologizing for the part of the perpetrator. But it is not as exceptional a crime as we have come to believe. In fact, this is a very common crime. That does not mean it is not serious. It's quite a common crime. If you look at the entire canvas of rape, you can divide rapes into many ways. And one of the ways of dividing is rape happening in relationships, and rape happening with strangers, and rape happening in conflict situations. This is one way of classifying rape. That rape which happens, let us say, in marriage, the marital rape. Rape that happens in an ongoing relationship. Rape happening between relatives. This is one category of rapes. There is a second category of rape, which is rapes happening on strangers in a regular social situation. And then you have rape happening in conflict situations. It may happen on known people, it may happen on unknown people, but it's a conflict situation. Either individual conflict, family conflict, or a group conflict, or even a national conflict. But it's a conflict situation. So there, in a conflict situation, rape is weaponized. It's one of the weapons of war to inflict shame, dishonor, and pain on the enemy. So the reasons for rape, they are completely different. They have nothing to do with individual dynamics. They have more to do with group dynamics. So if we look at the three rapes, the first one is usually not as brutal and barbaric. The second one can be a normal rape. It can be a barbaric, brutal rape. And the third one usually is barbaric and brutal. So if we look at all the three, the archetypical projection in media is that of a barbaric and brutal rape, but all rapes are not of that type. So this barbaric and brutal rape is one particular type of rape. And there are different types of rapes, and each have their own causality, their own ecosystem in which they can easily happen, and ecosystem in which they cannot happen, or it's very difficult for them to happen. And different sets of remedies to address the causes to whatever extent it can be addressed. So this is one part of it, that we have to look at rape as very different types of rape. It's not one. And therefore the causes are different, the remedies are different. Second part is, it is not uncommon for people. In fact, most people are capable of rape. Now, I'm not apologizing, I'm not normalizing rape. But this is where the activist brigade pounces upon you. The moment you start analyzing it in any terms other than that of the condemned devil, they will pounce upon you and they won't allow you to analyze anything. And they will sit on holier than thou throne and condemn you as somebody who is trying to normalize rape or defend the rapist or a pervert oneself. All kinds of allegations will come. And that is what has stopped the real cold analysis and a comprehensive engagement and understanding of the problem. So it's not uncommon for people to be capable of rape. We can see that rape not happening is more a shame and fear issue and less of a guilt issue. If you give a carte blanche to anybody and say, law will not do anything to you, do what you want, you will see a great number of people that otherwise you look as very civilized gentlemen committing this. So that animal inside is rearing to go. And this is what Freud also said. In two ways, he said, twice he said it. One, it was in letter to Einstein. Because Einstein and Freud both were Jews, and both of them saw horrible things being committed in World War II, and both of them had many relatives who died or who were tortured very brutally by the German regime. So Einstein wrote a letter to Freud to ask him why people do this kind of destructive acts. And the whole world is into a World War situation. Every day, you are destroying property which took years to build and which will again take years to build. And every day you have new orphans, new widows, new people dead, new people losing their hands and legs. And why people can't see the madness of it and stop it? I mean, the madness of it is very obvious. Why people can't see it and they can't stop it? And Freud said the unconscious forces of aggression, sadism, domination are too strong for the forces of reason and love to hold them back. The ego and the superego are no match for the power of the id. And inside man, because the id wins against the ego and the superego, on the outer world, you see what you see. In the inside world, once the world war is lost, in the outer world, you will see the world war going on. So this was one, the power of the unconscious. The whole idea of the rational man is actually a completely misleading idea. And killing, torture, rape, abduction, these have been very common acts in the entire human history. They are not as exceptional as we want them to believe, because we live in a very sanitized world, and we are lucky we are living in such a sanitized world. But if you look at the history of our ancestors, this is quite common. Rape is not as uncommon as we today believe it to be. That is one part. Second, Freud wrote about it in Civilization and Discontents. And he said, we are civilizing at a pace with which the ego is not able to catch up. The superego is not able to catch up, and the id is not able to catch up. And in order to be civilized, we have to give up parts of our id, and that in turn creates frustration. And that, when it becomes too much, we need a cyclical release. So after every few decades, we have a release event where the id, which has been controlled in the process of civilization, and that pent-up control, it releases itself. And that gives us a very different insight into the human mind, which tells us that this is not as uncommon an act as we want it to believe. It's a very common human act that does not take away the seriousness of it, but it places it in a very different context. That if we look at fantasies of people, rape fantasies are very common. If we look at pornography consumption, pornography involving rape is very common. If we go to red light area, rapes are very common. Customers asking for service where they can rape somebody also is common. If we look at any human conflict, any war, any group conflict, again, rape, weaponizing of rape is very common. So one component is that it is not as exotic a crime, as exceptional a crime as we believe it to be. It's a very common crime, serious crime, but a common crime. And it's very common for an individual to have these desires. It's not common to act them out, but it's definitely common to have desires.
If you say it is very common to have it as a desire, and it's a manifestation of unconscious forces which takes place, why it is more in men?
Because the animality is more in men. Number one. Number two, the biological construction is such, it is easier for them to rape than for women to rape. And three, biologically they are stronger. Because rape would, by definition, involve a non-consensual forcible act. And for a forcible act, you require more physical strength. But the first thing I would say is very important, that the animality, the barbarism is more in men than in women. So if you look at it in terms of yin and yang, it is more a yang quality. The domination, the brutality, right? The barbarism, that is more of a yang quality, not a yin quality. So in very masculine women, you can see that element, because the yang is very strong. So what we are dealing with is control of something which is very natural and is put in control partly by morality, partly by fear, and partly by shame. And when these three are diluted, the desire comes out. And the surest guarantee against it, of course, is the morality. Because you cannot have a policeman for every male. No country can do it. So if 75% of men have these desires and cannot control, you can't put 75% of each man with a policeman. And this also leads to the whole superego argument that the superego strengthening is very necessary. If the culture gets into a situation where a strong superego is not cultivated, obviously it predisposes people towards crime of all types, including this one. So this is where we have to look at it, start looking at the issue as a very serious but a very common issue, and that which is held in check more by morality and the shame involved in social situations rather than by law. And you can see the difference. If you look at a city, like take two cities, take Ahmedabad and Delhi, or take Chandigarh and Delhi, or take Chennai and Delhi, you can see a world of difference in terms of rapes. So, which means that the culture, the social setting has a very important role to play apart from law and order. Law and order are not very different in these two places. But there's something in the culture that most people are able to control themselves and they don't go out in acting out that perverted desire. You can see in Gujarat, I mean, you can't think of a Navratri-like situation in any difficult northern state like Bihar or UP, Haryana or Delhi, the kind of situation we see in Gujarat at night. And obviously, it is not a law and order issue, it's a culture issue. In psychoanalytic term, it's more of a superego issue. It's a guilt and a shame issue. So those are the starters to start off with, and then we can go into deeper part of that phenomenon.
So whenever there are such news available on media or takes the spotlight for the whole nation to think about, the first thing which comes to one's mind, listening to the kind of modus operandi used for the rape or to destroy the evidence, everybody tries to find the reason behind it. Many pass it under the rug saying that it is to do with the sexual desire, but we all know it is much more beyond that. So let us focus on this important point as it has come up, the reason of rape.
That's a very important component, the reason for rape. And this leads us to a detailed understanding of the phenomena, that it is not one thing, it is actually 10, 15 different things which is designated by one name. So in that sense, rape is not a name, it's a name of a category. It is not rape, it is not the name of one act, it's a category name for 10 to 15 acts which are different. And without understanding them, we still cannot solve the problem. So let's look at the different types of rape that we see. The first is one of sexual frustration, which is what people believe that this is the only type of rape, that because somebody is sexually frustrated and deprived, he goes on to rape. This is the only thing that people believe, but this is only one particular type of it. Then there is another kind of rape, which is out of fantasies. That one is not deprived, one has sexual partners, one is adequately satisfied, but one has a strong fantasy of rape. So there's a second category of people, and this would more likely go, as we saw in the classification, to the red light area rather than for a stranger. Most of them won't actually have that kind of a criminal courage to do it to strangers. So they would go in more for a paid rape, so to say. But that is a category of rape out of fantasies. The third is out of power. Many people point it out that rape is not about sex, it's about power. So it can be done to somebody, by a man to a woman, just to establish his power superiority. And this may be done to somebody who has humiliated you, or to somebody who is innocent, but that humiliation and the anger is displaced onto that person. So then it becomes a revenge by displacement. But essentially it is power. By anybody who feels not adequately powered up, he can execute this just to give himself a kick of power. So this is a very different category of rape, the rape of power, where he is not sexually deprived, he is not driven by fantasies, he is driven by a power inferiority. And he wants to show his power. And he does that by showing the woman her place in his mind. And that domination allows him that kick of power for some time. And then often he can brag about it to his friends. Then we have that of humiliation, rape of humiliation. That you have been humiliated by somebody and you want to take revenge. And often that happens literally, and often that happens by displacement. And this is very common in case of men who come from village to work in the cities, and they work in very lowly paid and humiliating conditions. Say a watchman or a driver or somebody who is cleaning things. And in their village, they were highly respected, and suddenly they find complete loss of respect. They could never imagine that they could be humiliated this way. In the village, they thought they would be humiliating somebody else, but nobody would dare to humiliate them. And in the city, because of poverty, they have taken up those jobs where unthinkable humiliation is happening to them. And often when they cannot stand it, they would commit a rape to a woman who has humiliated them, and that would be an act of revenge. If they cannot do it literally, they would do it to somebody else, and it would be a revenge by displacement. So that's a very separate, different category of rape of humiliation. Then there is rape of social revenge. It is like a group of people who believe some other group of people is belittling them, looking down upon them, humiliating them, and a person from this group commits a rape on the women of that group. It's a rape of social revenge. This is very common actually in Pakistan, where people who migrated from India, the Muhajirs, between them and the local groups of Sindh, it's very common that you rape a woman of the other group to avenge what they did or some other humiliation they have inflicted upon you. Or you cannot win in a gunfight, so you do this to take revenge. Then we have the rape of moral retribution. But this is very important to understand. It's very sociological. Consider a person coming from a village to a city, and he becomes, let us say, a security person in a high-end society. And women in those high-end society are the liberal types. They dress up very provocatively, very exposingly. To this man, this is highly immoral act. And these women, which according to him don't have any morality, they are sluts and deserve to be punished. They deserve to be raped because they have called for it.
I remember that was the sentence used by Nirbhaya's rapist, that since she was roaming at odd hours with a boyfriend, she was not of good character. This is what she deserved.
So she deserved it. She called for it. This is what she wanted. This is what goes on in the mind of the perpetrator when you have rape of this type, that this is a rape of moral retribution. That somebody is committing a great immorality, which in the village would have been unthinkable and would have been punished very severe. In earlier times, it could have also led to honor killing. That kind of thing, which is actually falling in the category of honor killing in the village, now they see day in and day out, and they are not able to control the moral rage inside of them. And we underestimate the power of the moral rage. Don't believe that people have such morality, but we have to remember what psychoanalysis tells us. We are far more than we believe. We are far more immoral than we believe, and we are far more moral than we believe. Somebody who does not care for morality consciously may have a very strong superego pathology in the unconscious. And somebody who is extremely moral, consciously speaking, may have deeply immoral fantasies in the unconscious. So we are far more than we believe, and many of them who come to the cities and see this, the cultural shock is too much for them. And whenever there is a cultural shock, whenever the supports of the superego are taken away, whenever there is a large change of the social context, there is a severe regression to a very harsh superego. And this you can see in a softer form in people who emigrate from India to USA. They suddenly become very religious because all the supports of the superego are taken away. The attachments are suddenly torn apart. And as attaching beings, we keep attaching to everything and every place. We keep throwing, it's like a radar. We keep throwing attachment waves outside of us all the time. And we get attached to everything, even non-living things, even cities, even bus stands. So
that has to do with the guilt of abandoning the omnipotent motherland.
Yeah. So then they become suddenly very religious. So the same thing happens here in a much harsher scale, that there is a very severe regression and a very harsh superego which gets into the moral retribution. Then we have the rape of group machoreness. In the male groups, it's very common to boast about and impress others by being more macho than the some person next to you. And there, this becomes one of the elements of boasting about oneself. That is one another category. Then there are rates of sadism. The sadism in the person is so high that he has to do that brutality and mix sexuality and brutality. You can also have the unaccepted homosexuality in the person raging, which can also lead to this. We can have lack of activation of masculinity also leading to rape, another category of rapes. That one is not sure of one's masculinity, so one rapes usually women who are very weak or somebody who is very younger to you. The pedophilic rape types, they usually fall in this category of not being sure of their masculinity or having a latent bisexuality. Then we have rape of the isolation and alienation, the lone wolf rape. Somebody who comes to the city and is completely alone. Somebody who works in another village but completely alone. Completely feels alienated and isolated in the environment. Nobody to talk to, nobody to attach to. And the lone wolf is by and large anxious, at times depressed, at times raging. And there is little to hold him back because he does not think what will happen to him, what will happen to his family members. There are no ties of attachment to make him think of the consequences. And there is rage towards society in general, and that floating, amorphous, inchoate rage can coalesce on a woman. And then there is a category of rape which is psychopathology. This involves many psychopathological conditions. It can involve psychopathy, it can involve psychosis, it can involve narcissism and perversion. It can involve only perversion. It can involve fixation and some fetishes. It can involve strange fantasies. It can involve revenge from the mother. It can involve revenge from women because other women have humiliated you or left you high and dry. So this is an entire range of rape because of psychopathology. So we see that each rape has very different causality. It is a very different type, and we can see that in action also. And one reporter in Bombay had remarked very succinctly, she said she was raped and then she wrote about it. And she said when that man was doing it or trying to do it, what was in his mind was very different from what these activists tell us. So these are different types of rapes, each with different causality, different modality of implementation. And therefore, the solutions to each of them have to be thought out. And it's the whole package when we implement will really get results. And we'll really be able to roll back the tragedy that we are seeing rolling out on the streets of the cities. The situation that women cannot go out at night, I think that itself tells us how uncivilized the cities are. That we can be civilized only in the daylight. The moment the daylight goes, the unconscious takes over. The jungle takes over. So the civilization is part-time. It's a part-time civilization. And it is fortunately not true for all the cities, but in some cities it is true. So what is in those cities where it is not true, lessons from there have to be implemented in cities where civilization is part-time.
So as we're talking about the reasons of rape, we come usually how the society, media, they talk about and they describe the different reasons, not justified enough, obviously. Can we say that in a blanket term that rape is an illegitimate child of patriarchy in certain ways?
Uh,
As you're talking about the power play, as you're talking about the dominance, as you're talking about how patriarchy drives, objectifies women as a source of pleasure for the cranial desires. So,
partly it is true. Partly it is true that it has something to do with patriarchy and the values that patriarchy holds in high regard. So the values that patriarchy, the system brings in, that is partly responsible, no doubt about it. But there are certain forms which will be true even in a matriarchal society. Like it is like there are certain elements of the psyche which are not